Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Hassam Munir, and welcome to my first official YouTube video, I guess, slash podcast. Whatever this ultimately turns out to be. Didn't come in here with like a great plan, but I do have a vision to share, aspects of Islamic history that are usually not paid much attention to through the video format. I'm not too comfortable in front of camera, to be honest, but it's going to be a learning journey. I really wanted to record this video because, I've been encouraged by so many people over the years, but especially recently, and many of them know who they are and they might be watching this. And just know that I'm really grateful for your encouragement, for all the advice you've given. And I am going to, just put this up regardless of how it turns out. And like I said, it'll be a learning journey, inshallah, God willing. So, as I mentioned, that this will be very much about Muslim history, Muslim experiences, especially things that usually fall through the cracks or just aren't paid much attention to, especially within the Muslim community, and generally focusing more on Muslim cultural and social history because that's where I find a lot of the fascinating details and points of reflection come out from. So we're going to focus on that aspect of Muslim history, especially, but we'll cover all kinds of things and not going in any particular order at this point. We'll just cover things interesting, sort of tidbits from history as we kind of proceed through this series of videos. So I'm not going to go into like a long preamble or like an introduction about who I am and things like that. We'll get there and slowly you'll learn more about me, inshallah, through this channel. But what I do want to do in this first video is give you a sense of the types of topics that I'm interested in and also just share something interesting about Islamic history that you may not have come across before. And so I thought I'd start with the history of diabetes in Muslim cultures. Now, why? One, because I'm diabetic myself. It's an huge part of my life, a huge sort of driving factor in my day-to-day experiences, and so it's very important to me. And I know many Muslims and non-Muslims as well around the world, of course, live with this condition. And I just want to give you sort of an interesting perspective on how Muslim physicians and thinkers engage with this illness in the past. And also, I think that would be a good example that would give you a good sense of the kinds of topics I'm interested in. So when I say social and cultural history or history that falls through the cracks or the gaps in our conversations about Muslim history, what exactly do I mean? This may be your first time ever even thinking that there would be a history of diabetes in Muslim culture. So that's what I'm trying to give you a sense of, that these are the topics that I'm interested in covering through this channel, inshallah. So I am going to, again, just share some interesting facts that will, hopefully enlighten you of the history of diabetes in Muslim cultures, and also just what this channel and this podcast, inshallah, is going to be all about. So diabetes is a chronic illness, as we know. It's very prevalent today. We know that as well. But it's been known for a really long time in human history. The earliest sort of mention of it that we find, and I'm just going to read off my notes here again, just working with this new approach to recording myself like this. But there's something known as the Ebers Papyrus, which was produced in ancient Egypt about 3,500 years ago. And also in ancient Indian and Chinese civilizations, it was recognized, of course, not at the level that we understand today, but that there is an illness with a certain series of symptoms, which would eventually come to be known as diabetes. But of course, it was not very well understood. Even by the Muslims, it would not be well understood until modern times. So we'll talk about that. But all of these descriptions basically center on three main symptoms: excessive discharge of urine, right? So using the washroom a lot, polyuria, And related to that would be excessive thirst because you are dehydrating yourself from urinating so frequently. The second one was the sweetness of the urine, right? So glycouria, and this is very interesting because it's fascinating that um, with modern technology and everything we have today, we may not think about these things, but how did they actually kind of measure the sugar content in the urine or try to make sense of it? Oftentimes, and this is a pretty graphic image, but just by tasting it on their tongue, right? And that's the kind of humility that physicians had to approach their work with as they tried to navigate this condition and help the people that they were trying to treat. And then the third symptom was the gradual wasting away of the body because, if you understand anything about diabetes, it's very much centered on sort of the distribution of the energy produced in the cells, right? And so if that process is disrupted because there's no insulin or the insulin is not effective within the body is gradually going to waste away because the cells in all different parts of the body are not able to make sufficient sort of energy for themselves to keep going. So these were the symptoms that were recognized, that, and the third one being, like I said, that the body would gradually waste away as well. Um, those who discussed diabetes in the early Muslim culture, they relied mostly on the theories that were developed by the Greeks, right? So it's not clear, where or by whom exactly the term diabetes was actually coined, but it seems that we can trace it all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Diabetes, if you go into like the etymology of it, it means to run through, right? To run through something. And what this referred to in this context is water simply running through the body of the patient, right? Again, like we mentioned, frequent urination and excessive thirst was the primary symptom, one of the three, but even among those, the primary symptom that was associated with this illness, right? So drinking a lot of water, but just like kind of, urinating it out. And that's why we get this term to run through diabetes. Um, and definitely one of the earliest mentions dates back to the year 130 of the Common Era, which we're in right now, by one of the Greek thinkers. And he says, diabetes is a wonderful affection, not very frequent among men. So it's not, very prevalent at that point, he says. And he says the patients never stop making water, but the flow is incessant, as if from the opening of aqueducts, right? So you'll see this imagery come up again and again because of that excessive thirst situation. He says the nature of the disease then is chronic, and it takes a long period to form, to develop, but the patient is short-lived once they actually develop it. The melting of the body, he means, is rapid, and the death is speedy. The death comes quickly. Moreover, life is disgusting and painful. Thirst is unquenchable. The drinking is excessive. So he gets into like this almost poetic kind of and tragic description of this illness. Um, and this was the understanding that the Muslims would develop as well. The famous physician Galen offered similar description of diabetes, but he added, very insightfully. Of course, he was wrong, but he added that it's a disease of the kidneys. So he associated that illness with the kidneys, and he said that it's rare, and he had personally only come across 2 cases of it. Um, Now, the Muslims inherit this knowledge through the translation movement, and they learn about this illness as well. And of course, Muslims would also, have to face this illness. People actually lived with it. And we have some interesting clues as to people, famous people or known people in Muslim history who may have lived with diabetes, but nonetheless, we don't know for sure, of course, because they were never diagnosed. And it was never sort of a possibility for them to actually understand properly what it was that they were suffering from. One of those people is the Abbasid, ruler al-Wathiq, who was the grandson of the famous Harun al-Rashid of the Abbasid dynasty. And so he had sort of some of the symptoms that we know to be associated with diabetes, also the excessive buildup of certain fluids in the body, because all of your natural processes are disrupted. But it's also theorized that he may have had some sort of liver disease as opposed to diabetes. So he found some of the symptoms that he had would kind of abate, right? Would go away, or decrease in intensity if he exposed his body to intense heat. So he had this special oven, like a tandoor, right? Literally built in his palace in Baghdad. And he would have tamarisk wood brought in and heated, and he would actually sit inside the oven until he passed out, and then he would be taken out and he would be sort of cooling off. But for some reason, right, again, we haven't sort of explored this thoroughly, and perhaps we'll never know, but he found some relief with that suffering, that illness that he had. He found some relief actually putting himself in an oven and kind of like baking himself, literally. Um, it's recorded that one of the things that he would say when he suffered through this illness is that may God forgive me, may Allah forgive me for my lapse, and may he lift the burden from my head. That he would actually pray for relief because of the intensity of the symptoms. And he's said to have actually died while he was in the oven exposing himself to this intense heat. And there's a theory that he was actually left in there for too long. He was supposed to be pulled out, but he wasn't for whatever reason, and that is how he passed away. Um, Historians speculate that he may have had some form of diabetes. In diabetes has a relationship with food. Obviously, it's important to note that he was known as al-Akul, right? He was known as the glutton. He loved to eat, and he ate a lot, right? And it's even mentioned, and this may be an exaggerated report, but this Muslim ruler al-Wathiq would sometimes eat 40 cooked eggplants in one sitting, right? So food consumption doesn't necessarily cause diabetes, or that's not an immediate association. It's a lot more complicated than that, but nevertheless, we know some details about him that give us more reason to believe that he may have lived with diabetes. um, and so there would have been many other people as well, and that's why we have the Muslim physicians studying this illness, right? We have Muhammad ibn Zakariyya al-Rhazi, a very famous Muslim physician who died around the year 930. He dedicated a short work to diabetes, and he was probably the first person ever to speculate on the relationship between diabetes and eye problems, which is known today as diabetic retinopathy. We also have a Syrian philosopher and physician, Ibn al-Khammar, who died in the year 1017. He wrote about diabetes as well, as did the more famous physician, al-Latif al-Baghdadi, who died around the year 1231, who wrote a book titled Risala fil Marad al-Lazi Yasumma diyānīṭas, right? So the treatise on the disease named diabetes. As a present day historian points out, a historian of diabetes, she points out that diabetes is one of the most striking examples in Arabic medical literature of an illness whose description is quite accurate, even if sometimes partially deficient from our point of view, while its etiology is explained in a way that misses the disease's true origin, right? So, in other words, even though the Muslim physicians were not, and we wouldn't expect them to be able to correctly identify the true cause of diabetes. That only sort of be properly understood in the 1880s. Centuries and centuries later, after the people we're talking about, their efforts, the Muslim physicians' efforts to observe and treat the symptoms can be very much appreciated. Um, of course, we have to talk about Ibn Sina, right? The most famous of the Muslim physicians, the Persian physician, and many other things. He was a polymath. Ibn Sina, working in the early 11th century, so about 1,000 years ago, in his famous Canon of Medicine, the Qanun fil Tib, Ibn Sina refers to diabetes as diyānīṭas. And it seems that somewhere in the process of transliterating from the Greek texts to the Arabic text, the diacritic dot of the Arabic ba, right, had changed position and it was now pronounced as noon, right? So those of you who know Arabic will know what I'm talking about. The dot was just moved from below the main portion of the letter to above it, so the ba becomes a noon, and so diabetos becomes known as diyānīṭas. Ibn Sina, anyways, says diabetes is a disease in which the water exits from the body as it was drunk in a short time, right? So again, there's like this quick cycling of water through the body. He says one suffering from this illness is thirsty and drinks, but is not actually able to quench his thirst, but urinates the same amount as he drank, incapable of retention at all. So he mentions, again, using the available knowledge at the time, that it's most likely a disease of the kidneys as well as of the urinary tract. And he offers this 14-line description in the Qanun fil Tib of all of the symptoms, and follows that with 2 pages that contain 22 different prescriptions that could be used for treatment. Um, Now, Ibn Sina, was using the theory of humors, which was the predominant theory used to explain health and illness in pre-modern times in many parts of the world. And so, for him, diabetes represented some kind of imbalance of the humors. And so, if certain sort of concoctions and recipes and the herbs and all of these things were brought together, and medicine was produced that way, it would balance out the humors, and he hoped that would help alleviate, if not the illness itself, then at least some of the symptoms of that particular illness. um, he said that diabetes is the dulab, which is the water wheel, right? Because the body of the individual is constantly sort of recycling water without actually being able to benefit from it, itself. So he says that diabetes is a malicious disease. It could lead to strong fevers, irregular appetite, loss of sexual function, emaciation. And again, that's emaciation, the wasting away of the body that was sort of observed since ancient times. So, based on this, Ibn Sina suggests some treatments. He says cooling off the heat of the kidneys is essential. So that seems, opposite of what Ibn al-Wathiq was doing, a few centuries earlier. So he said, induce some nausea, some perspiration, stay in a cool environment, bathe in cold water, don't put too much strain on your back, especially. And, he also said that diabetes that was caused by a particular series of symptoms that he referred to as the coldness of the body. He prescribed hijama, right? So cupping, massaging, moderate exercise. He specifically suggests horseback riding as an exercise, as well as hot baths in that situation. And he suggests, particular foods should be consumed: almonds, meat, milk, plums, radish, vinegar, what he refers to as the moistening drugs, right? So trying to retain the moisture within the body. So he says, apple or mint and things that are produced from those sources of nourishment. And he also, of course, advocates for adequate sleep, and laxatives if you're dealing with constipation due to diabetes, and all of these different types of things. He gets more specific, obviously, like I mentioned just a short while ago, and now he has these recipes, right? The 22 recipes that we mentioned, cucumber juice, rose water, water mixed with roasted pumpkin or gourd, right? Or water mixed with sour pomegranate, right? He has these recipes for soups that are made specifically from the meat of a young lamb, and a dressing made of gruel, and all of these reasons, these kind of ingredients that I don't want to go through the entire list, but it gets very specific, like apple leaves, right? Pomegranate peels and things like that. He suggests that diabetics they sniff camphor, right, water lily, that they actually expose themselves to good scents, and all of these things will help. And what's fascinating about that is that this seems far fetched to us today, of course. And of course, again, it was missing the true cause of diabetes and the true treatment for it, and a cure is not yet available. But historians of medicine have determined that 75% of all the plants or plant based drugs that Ibn Sina mentioned in these 22 recipes that he had put together are effective in the treatment of diabetic symptoms, and 69% have a specific hypoglycemic effect, meaning they lower your blood sugar, which is essentially the treatment for diabetes. So almost 70% of these recipes that Ibn Sina is putting together will have some benefit to a person who is kind of living with diabetes. So it's fascinating considering the time that he was living at, and also keeping in mind that that interplay between ambition and humility. Like, that what you're doing is actually unlikely to resolve the problem for the patient, to resolve the patient of much of their suffering, and yet you never give up. You never sort of give up on the cause of just continuing to experiment, and continuing to develop these kind of recipes and these treatments that you hope somebody would benefit from. Um, the Qanun fil Tib, of course, the Canon of Medicine, Ibn Sina's sort of main work, would remain a standard textbook of medicine in Muslim lands and in Europe for centuries afterwards. And no, really significant development would follow in terms of understanding diabetes more properly until the late 1700s. That's where the story starts to pick up again. So the Syrian physician Ibn al-Nafis, also quite famous in the history of medicine in the 13th century. He doesn't have much to add to what Ibn Sina was sort of providing. Even the Jewish physician and the philosopher Musa ibn Maymun, also known as Maimonides, who died in around the year 1204. He was from al-Andalus, and later he worked in Egypt as well. So he's a physician, but he said that he came across many patients in Egypt who had sort of diabetes, and he speculated that diabetes, especially in Egypt, may be more prevalent in warmer countries, or that perhaps, quote, perhaps the waters of the Nile, because of their sweetness, may play a role in this as well, right? So you see people, even after Ibn Sina and many of the earlier sort of physicians that we described, they're trying, right? But they're not really making much development, and we won't see much happen until the late 1700s. Another example of this is an individual named Ibn Zuhr, who lived in al-Andalus as well, in Muslim sort of Spain, Muslim Spain, and he died around the year 1168. And he was very fond of eating sweets, and he was very fond of eating figs, especially. And he actually wrote a book that was titled "The Preference of Honey Over Sugar." So, he had the sweet tooth, and he really enjoyed that. And it's assumed that these habits played a role in him developing an illness that was known as nagla or nugla, right? And that is something that is prone to occur in diabetics, right? So it's kind of like an infection almost, that is known, and this might be a side effect of uncontrolled diabetes. So his father is said to have passed away. His father was a physician as well, but he himself is said to have passed away from a similar condition. And it has been suggested that both of them, this famous physician Ibn Zuhr as well as his father Abu al-A'la, right, are both sort of sort of may have been diabetic. Sorry. So this is an ongoing sort of research project, right? Maybe we'll find more on this. Maybe we'll kind of find a lot more detail. We continue to search, we continue to learn, and hopefully, inshallah, one day we can tell the story more comprehensively. And also, with the prevalence of diabetes and all the research that happens today, just make sure that all of the efforts in the more distant past are also acknowledged, right? And it's reminded that, if we're able to, like we say, right, in the English language, if we're able to see further and do more and get closer to the kind of cures and solutions to the illnesses that we experience, then it's by standing on the shoulders of giants and people who made incredible efforts to get us to this point. So I am, just going to wrap up the video there. And I appreciate you all for listening. Hopefully, you learned something new, and hopefully, you'll see a lot more of these videos. Well, you will, inshallah, God willing. And please, I've waited my whole life to say this. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon. I think I'm supposed to say something like that. And if you're listening on other platforms as well, whatever you're able to do to subscribe and share and just kind of support me on this learning journey, so we can learn together, inshallah, and stay connected. I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.